For most of your life, you've been told to feed the plant. Pour something out of a bag, water it in, and wait. But the folks who grew enough food to carry a family right through the lean years knew something we've quietly let slip. They almost never fed the plant at all. They fed the soil and let the soil do the rest. Here's the part that catches even a lifelong gardener off guard. Nearly everything those old hands buried in the ground was something the rest of us carried to the curb. Banana peels, coffee grounds, a handful of crushed eggshells, the leaves nobody wanted. And their gardens didn't just scrape by on it, they thrived. Think about that for a moment. The richest garden on the block, fed entirely by the things the neighbors were paying to haul away. No secret seeds, no special soil trucked in, just a different idea about what a garden actually eats. Today we're going to walk through 20 things your grandmother used to bury in her garden for free. And I'll be straight with you. A few of them sound strange enough that you'll want to argue with me before you try them. That's all right. Some of the best things in a garden look like foolishness right up until the morning they work. So pour yourself something warm and sit with me a minute. Because this isn't about starting over. It's about one quiet idea the seed catalogs spent 100 years teaching all of us to forget. If you've ever knelt down beside a tired tomato after doing everything the label told you and still wondered what on earth you were doing wrong, I want you to hear this clearly. It was almost never you. You were following the instructions on the bag, and the bag was never written to make your soil better. It was written to be bought again next spring. That's not a conspiracy. Nobody locked this knowledge away in a vault. It's something simpler, and in a way, sadder. There's a reason you've never seen most of what we'll talk about today on a garden center shelf. You can't bottle it, you can't patent it, and you certainly can't sell it back to a gardener every single season. It costs almost nothing, and in an industry built on the next bag, the one thing a free idea is never allowed to be is profitable. So, it just faded. Out of the catalogs, off the shelves, out of the advice. Not because it stopped working, but because nobody had a reason left to remind you of it. The good news is, your soil never forgot. It is far more forgiving than that bag ever let on. Give it a single season of the old way, and it begins to mend itself. And I know how that feels because I've stood right where you're standing. You read the back of the bag, you do everything it says, the garden still sulks, and somewhere in there a quiet little voice wonders if maybe you've simply lost your touch. You haven't. The touch was never in the bag. It was always in the few increased of soil under your feet, waiting for you to stop buying and start building. Now, here's the idea that changes how you'll look at every scrap in your kitchen from this day on. A plant doesn't eat the way we do. It can't reach into a banana peel and pull the goodness out. But underneath your garden, in a single handful of healthy soil, there are more living creatures than there are people on this whole earth. Fungi, bacteria, earthworms, a quiet, busy workforce. And those are the ones doing the eating. They break things down, and in the breaking down, they hand your plants exactly what they need, right at the root, in a form the roots can actually take up. So when Grandma buried a peel, or a fish head, or an armful of leaves, she wasn't feeding her tomatoes. She was feeding the crew that feeds the tomatoes. Feed the soil, and the soil feeds the plant. That is the whole secret. Everything else we cover today is just 20 different ways of setting the table for that underground crew. And here's the honest promise, so you know what to expect, because I won't sell you an overnight miracle. The first year, you're mostly waking the soil up and feeding the crew. You'll see a little improvement, but the real change is still happening underground. By the second year, the soil holds water better, crusts less, and asks less of you. And by the third year, you've got that dark, crumbly, living earth that grows food almost on its own. Slow, yes, but it never washes away in the next rain, and you never have to buy it back. Let's start with the 3 things that wake them up the fastest. These first 3 are the worm wakers, the fastest way to bring a tired bed back to life. If your grandparents kept a victory garden, or your folks fed a family off a quarter-acre lot, this was the rhythm they lived by, even if nobody ever wrote it down. The first one is the one you make every single day without thinking. Kitchen vegetable scraps. Squash peels, carrot tops, the outer cabbage leaves, the soft end you trim off a tomato. Most of us drop it in the trash. Grandma kept a bowl by the sink, and at the end of the day, she'd dig a little trench between her rows, 8 to 12 inches deep, tip it all in, and cover it back over. Why it works is simple. Those scraps are a feast for the underground crew, and as the worms and microbes break them down, they release nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, just about everything your soil is hungry for, right where the roots are waiting. There's a name for it now that Grandma never used: trench composting. No bin to turn, no pile to fuss over. You just bury and move on down the row next time. The mistake to dodge? Go easy on citrus and onion. A few orange peels won't hurt a thing, but a whole bowl of them, week after week, and the worms will quietly pack up and leave. The second one will sound a little odd, and I understand if you raise an eyebrow. Stale bread. When a loaf went hard or started to turn, Grandma didn't toss it. She'd dig a shallow hole, 4 inches or so, drop it in, and cover it up. Here's the part she understood without ever reading it in a book. The mold that blooms on old bread is a fungus, and fungus is exactly what an earthworm comes looking for. Bury that bread, and within a day or 2, the fungi move in, and the worms follow right behind them. Now, the honest cautions, because they matter. Skip the heavily salted stuff, the pretzels and the salty crackers. Too much salt is hard on the very soil life you're trying to feed. And here's the one most folks never think of. A lot of store-bought bread is made with preservatives designed to stop mold. The very thing you want to happen, the loaf is built to prevent. So reach for the homemade end of the bread box, or a loaf that's already well past its date, and bury it deep enough that you're feeding worms, not inviting the neighbor's dog to dinner. The third one is sitting in your bathroom and your recycling bin right now. Plain cardboard and the little tube from a roll of toilet paper. It doesn't look like food, and to your plants it isn't. But to the soil, cardboard is carbon, the steady, slow fuel the whole underground crew runs on. Push a cardboard tube down into the bed standing upright, or tear a box into pieces and soak it, and in a few weeks, it's gone. Flip over a buried piece a week later, and you'll find a knot of worms underneath, every time. There's a bigger version of this the old-timers used, and the permaculture folks now call it sheet mulching. Lay whole, flat sheets of cardboard right over a patch of weeds or grass, pile 4 to 6 inches of compost or soil on top, and plant into that. The weeds below give up, the cardboard melts away, and the worms move in to take their place. Grandma called it the lazy way. Turns out, it's also the smart way. Just one rule. Strip off every bit of plastic tape and those glossy colored stickers first. That shiny coating is plastic, and it has no business in your soil. Every autumn, the whole neighborhood rakes a small fortune to the curb. Dead leaves. Grandma had a name for them. She called them brown gold, and she meant it. While everyone else was bagging theirs, she was raking hers straight onto the beds and into the trenches. By spring, those leaves turn into something dark and crumbly and soft. And it isn't quite compost. It's leaf mold, made almost entirely by fungi. And leaf mold has one quality the store-bought amendments would love to claim. It can hold several times its own weight in water. In a dry July, that's the difference between soil that bakes and soil that stays cool and damp around the roots. Better than the bag of peat at the garden center. And it falls out of the sky for free. Want it faster? Run the mower over the pile first. Shredded leaves are ready in a couple of months instead of most of a year. The one mistake to avoid: keep walnut leaves out. They carry a compound called juglone that quietly stunts a lot of plants, tomatoes most of all. Oak, maple, beech, those are your friends. The fifth one comes off your lawn every week all summer, and most of it gets bagged and hauled away. Grass clippings. After the mowing, Grandma would scatter a thin layer, an inch or two, right around her vegetables. Fresh clippings run about 4% nitrogen, which means every time you mow, you're producing a free, gentle feeding for the garden. There's even a name for skipping the bag and leaving them on the lawn: grass cycling. The university extension folks will tell you it can return up to a quarter of your lawn's yearly feeding right back into the turf. Your county extension office was telling folks exactly this 50 years ago. Somewhere along the way, between the bag and the billboard, we simply stopped listening. But 2 warnings here, and please don't skip them. First, and this is the big one, if your lawn has been treated with a weed killer or a bug spray, keep those clippings far away from anything you plan to eat. Those chemicals carry right over and can damage your food crops. Second, mow before the grass goes to seed, or you'll be planting next year's weeds with your own 2 hands. Other than that, every mowing is money in the soil. The 6th one shows up at the end of the season, when the last ears have been picked. Corn cobs and stalks. Most folks drag them off to be hauled away. Grandma cut them into pieces and buried them right where they'd grown. Corn stalks are about as carbon-rich as a home garden gets, roughly 60 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. As they break down, they leave the soil loose and full of little air pockets, the kind of open, breathing soil that roots push through easily and water soaks into instead of running off. Cut into short lengths, they're gone in a couple of months. Left whole, you're waiting half a year or more. And there's something worth pausing on here. Grandma buried fish under that corn, grew beams up alongside it, and let the squash sprawl across the ground below. That was the 3 sisters, a way of gardening this continent's first farmers worked out over more than 1,000 years, where nothing was waste and everything fed something else. The newest idea in your garden is usually the oldest one, finally remembered. The 7th one is the most ambitious thing on this whole list, and maybe the most powerful. Burying old logs and branches. When a limb came down in a storm, Grandma didn't haul it off or burn it. She buried it and let it become the heart of a garden bed. It even has a name now: hugelkultur, an old German word that just means mound culture. Here's the wonder of it. Buried wood acts like a giant sponge underground. It can soak up many times its own weight in water. When the rains come, the wood drinks the excess. When the dry spell hits, it lets that moisture seep slowly back to the roots. But here's the honest timeline, because this is one where patience pays. In the first year, fresh wood actually pulls nitrogen out of the soil as it starts to break down, and your plants can look hungry. The fix is easy. Lay grass clippings or coffee grounds over the top to make up for it. By the 2nd year, the soil settles, and from the 3rd year on, that bed holds water and grows food like almost nothing else, for years, from a log you'd otherwise have paid to have hauled away. That's the carbon backbone, the slow scaffolding the whole garden stands on. 7 things down, and every one of them free. Now, before we go any deeper, I want to give you something to keep. Before we go any further, and we're only 1/3 of the way through, I've gathered the heart of all this onto a single page you can tape right inside the shed door. The seasonal timeline. The short list of what to skip. The honest year 1 to year 3 of building living soil so you know what to expect and when. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for, nothing to buy. Then stay right here, because the next handful includes the one mistake most people make in the very first warm week of spring, and a couple that sound downright unbelievable until you hear why they work. The next group is the pantry, the slow, steady minerals that don't feed your plants overnight, but build a soil that stays fed for years. And this is exactly where a lot of well-meaning garden advice goes sideways. So I'm going to be honest with you about each one, even when the honest answer is a little less exciting than the headline. Crushed eggshells. Grandma treated them like they were precious. Rinsed, dried on the windowsill, crushed fine, and sprinkled around the tomatoes each spring. And they are good. An eggshell is almost entirely calcium carbonate, the very same thing that's in agricultural lime. But here I have to be straight with you, because you've probably heard otherwise. Eggshells do not cure blossom end rot, that sunken brown patch on the bottom of a tomato. For years, the advice was calcium, calcium, calcium. But blossom end rot is almost always a watering story, not a calcium shortage. The plant can't move calcium up to the fruit when the water comes and goes unevenly. So the real fix isn't a mineral at all. It's a steady, even drink of water. That rot was never hungry. It was thirsty for a routine. What eggshells actually do is feed your soil calcium slowly. And I mean slowly, over many months. So think of them as a long, patient investment, not a quick rescue. Grind them as fine as you can to hurry them along, and let time do the rest. Banana peels. You'll hear them called one of the richest sources of potassium there is. And here's my honest word, that's a bit of a tall tale. A banana peel holds a modest amount of potassium, with a little calcium and magnesium, and it gives it up slowly as it breaks down. Useful, yes. Miraculous? No. And anyone selling you a jaw-dropping number about banana peels is usually selling you something. The real trick is in how you use them. Bury a whole peel right next to a plant, and as the microbes break it down, they briefly borrow nitrogen from the soil around it, and you'll see the plant yellow a touch. So chop the peel into small pieces, or better yet, drop your peels in the compost. Grandma's other way was to soak them in a jar of water for a day or two, then pour that off at the base of the plant. A gentle potassium drink. Not magic, just a peel put to honest use, instead of the trash. Leftover bones. After a roast chicken or a pot of soup, Grandma dried the bones, cracked them with a hammer, sometimes baked them brittle, and ground them into a coarse powder she worked into the soil. What she made is exactly what the garden center bags up and sells as bone meal for a tidy sum. Bones are mostly calcium phosphate, and phosphorus is what a plant leans on for strong roots and good flowers. Ground fine, they feed the soil over a few months, left in bigger pieces a year or two. And unlike the harsh stuff, bone meal won't scorch your roots if your hand slips. One honest warning that'll make you smile. Dogs adore the smell. Work it down into the soil and water it in, or you'll wake to a freshly dug bed and one very pleased with himself retriever. Wood ash. If you've got a fireplace, you've got a bucket of free minerals every winter. Real wood ash is rich in potassium and calcium, and it works a lot like garden lime. It raises the pH of soil that's gone too sour, which most vegetables quietly appreciate. Here's where honest matters most, though. Wood ash is strong, and it's alkaline. A light dusting in spring is plenty. Never put it around your acid lovers. Blueberries, azaleas, and rhododendrons will slowly suffer for it. A simple soil test before you add much is worth the trouble. And one line I'll say plainly: never, ever use coal ash. Coal carries heavy metals that have no place anywhere near food. Wood from the fireplace, yes. Coal, never. Poultry feathers. If you've ever cleaned out an old down pillow, you are holding fertilizer. Feathers are keratin, the same protein as hair, and they run remarkably high in nitrogen, somewhere around 12 to 15%. Better still, they let it go slowly, feeding hungry plants like garlic and leafy greens steadily over months instead of washing away in the first hard rain. There's one catch, and it's a lovely reminder of everything we've talked about. Feathers only break down if your soil is alive. Lay them on tired, lifeless dirt, and they'll just sit there. Lay them on soil full of that busy crew, and the microbes unlock them for you. The feathers don't feed the plant, the living soil does. Crab and shrimp shells. Save them from a seafood dinner. They bring calcium and a little nitrogen, but their real gift is something called chitin, the tough stuff their shells are made of. Now this one is real science, so let me give it to you straight: the good and the limits both. When you bury chitin, you wake up the soil microbes that specialize in eating it. As they multiply, they go after anything else made of the same material, including the eggs of root knot nematodes, the tiny pests that attack plant roots, and certain harmful soil fungi. Researchers have measured this in the field, and it holds up. The honest catch is the amount. A few backyard shells won't clear a serious pest problem the way a heavy farm dose would. So don't think of it as a pest cure. Think of it as one more way to tip your soil's balance toward the helpers: slow, steady, and completely safe for birds, pets, and people. Used tea leaves. Don't toss them. And here's a happy surprise. Spent tea leaves are actually a touch richer than coffee grounds, running close to 4% nitrogen against coffee's 2%, with a little calcium and magnesium besides. Tear open the bag, scatter the leaves, or drop them in the compost. The one thing to watch is the bag itself. A great many of today's tea bags are sealed with plastic. They won't break down, and you don't want that fine plastic working into your soil. So either make sure your bags are plain paper or silk, or simply rip them open and bury the loose leaves. The leaves, yes. The plastic, never. We're deep in the pantry now, and I've saved one of the most argued over items for nearly last because it's sitting right by your coffee pot every single morning. And coffee grounds, the one most of us pour down the drain every single morning. Scatter them thin and mix them into the topsoil. They add a little nitrogen and help the soil hold its structure over time. But coffee grounds come wrapped in 2 myths, and clearing them up is half the gift. The first, that they'll turn your soil acidic. They won't. The acid washed out into the cup you already drank. Brewed grounds sit close to neutral, around a pH of 6.5. The one to thank for setting that record straight is Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, the horticulturist at Washington State University, who has spent years separating garden folklore from what the evidence actually shows. The second myth, that a ring of grounds keeps slugs away. It's a lovely idea, and it doesn't hold. The soil scientists at Oregon State found there simply isn't enough caffeine left in spent grounds to turn a single slug around. So, use your coffee grounds. They're good for the soil. Just don't ask them to do a job they were never going to do. And keep it a thin layer. Dump a whole week's worth in one heavy pile, and even the earthworms will steer around it. Now we come to the handful that make people nervous. The ones you'll read warnings about online. I'm not going to tell you they're all neat and tidy. I'm going to tell you the truth about each and let you decide. Fish heads and scraps. This may be the oldest gardening trick there is. You've likely heard the story that in 1621, a man named Squanto taught the pilgrims to bury a fish beneath each hill of corn. It's a good story, and I'll be honest with you that historians still argue over it. Some believe Squanto learned the method from European settlers, not the other way around. But here's what nobody argues about. A fish buried under a plant breaks down into a powerful, gentle feeding of nitrogen and phosphorus, and gardeners across the whole world found their way to it. How to do it without trouble. Dig down at least 12 inches. This is not the place to cut corners. Drop the scraps in and cover them well. Bury in the fall and let winter do the quiet work. The honest limitation is right there in your nose. Too shallow, and you'll invite every raccoon and stray dog for a mile. So go deep, and if the critters are stubborn, lay a piece of hardware cloth over the spot for the first couple of weeks. Next time you're at the fish counter, ask for the scraps at closing. Most places give them away. That's a bottle of fish fertilizer handed to you for nothing. I know the idea makes some folks squeamish, and that's fair. But bury it deep, walk away, and let winter do its quiet work. And by spring, you'll have forgotten it was ever there. Your tomatoes won't. Whole eggs. And yes, this one's a bit bold. Grandma would take an egg past its prime, dig a hole a good foot deep, drop it in, and cover it. Always in the fall, never in the heat of summer. By spring, it had broken down into nitrogen from the white and yolk and calcium from the shell. So does it work? It does. But I'll give you the same honest answer the experts give. This is more Grandma's flourish than her finest strategy. Crushed eggshells give you calcium more reliably, and compost gives you nitrogen more steadily. A whole egg breaks down slowly and unevenly, and the wildlife may well dig it up before it ever does its job. Try it if it tickles you. Just know there are easier roads to the very same place. Human hair and pet fur. Strange, I know. Grandma cleaned out the hairbrush, gathered the fur from brushing the dog, and buried it around the edges of the garden. And there's good sense in it. Hair is keratin, around 14% nitrogen by weight, a serious amount. The researchers at Mississippi State University, led by Dr. Vlacho Zeljazkov, actually showed that hair can feed plants about as well as a regular fertilizer as it breaks down. And it breaks down slowly, over a year or two, feeding little by little, just the way plants prefer. The one mistake to avoid is small. If the hair's been heavily dyed or chemically straightened, use just a little, and don't bury a whole salon's worth in one spot. Grandma also swore the scent of it kept the deer and rabbits off. The evidence there is thin, mostly stories, but a little mesh bag of hair on the fence line never cost her a thing to try. Plain newspaper. Grandma would lay 4 or 5 sheets flat between her rows and pile mulch on top. Simple as that, and it works. Newspaper under mulch smothers the weeds beneath it and helps the soil hold its moisture through a dry stretch, and as it breaks down, it gives a little carbon back to the ground. The fair question people ask is about the ink. Long ago, newspaper ink contained lead. Today's is soy-based, and plain newsprint is safe in the garden. The one thing to keep out is the glossy stuff, those shiny colored inserts and magazine pages, which carry plastic coatings that don't break down the way you want. So plain gray newsprint, yes. The shiny ad pages, no. And the 20th, Grandma's quiet secret weapon, comfrey. A big, rough-leafed plant most folks would call a weed and yank out. She kept one growing in a corner on purpose, and a few times a season, she'd cut the leaves and bury them right around her tomatoes and peppers, where they'd vanish into the soil within a couple of weeks. Here's why it earns its corner. Comfrey sends roots 6 to 8 feet down, far below where your vegetables can reach, and it hauls up potassium, calcium, iron, and other minerals from soil layers nothing else touches. Chop the leaves, Lay them on top or bury them shallow, and all of that deep earth wealth gets delivered right to the surface where your plants live. It's a pump, drawing up what the topsoil has spent. Grandma also made what she called comfrey tea, a bucket of chopped leaves left in water for a few weeks, then poured, well diluted, onto the soil around her plants. It smelled awful, and the garden loved it. And let me be plain about this one, because it matters. Comfrey belongs in the garden, fed to your plants and your soil. That is the whole of its place here. Used that way, it's one of the most generous things you can grow. Tuck one plant in a corner this spring, and within a season or two, you'll have a free, bottomless supply of mineral-rich mulch that asks for nothing but a pair of shears a few times a year. Now, before we close, I want to talk to you the way an old friend would. We've spent this whole time on things that the science backs up, but there's one piece of old folklore I'd like you to set down and leave in the past for good. Burying rusty nails in the garden. You've heard it, that a handful of rusty nails will green up yellowing leaves, or turn your hydrangeas blue by giving the soil iron. It's a kind notion. It just isn't true. Rust is iron oxide, and it's almost completely insoluble. A plant root simply can't take iron up in that form. And here's the deeper truth, the one that ties this whole day together. When leaves go yellow, it's rarely because the iron isn't there. It's usually because the soil's pH has drifted and locked up the iron that's already in the ground. A nail doesn't fix that. And while we're at it, a blue hydrangea is the work of aluminum and acid soil, not iron at all. And while we're being honest, here's a close cousin of that same mistake. You've surely heard that a scoop of Epsom salt at the base of a tomato puts a stop to blossom end rot. But Epsom salt is magnesium, and the rot is a calcium and water story. Pile on the magnesium, and you can actually crowd the calcium out and make the very thing worse. It's the same lesson wearing a different hat. The answer is a steady drink of water, not another mineral dropped in the hole. What a rusty nail will do is lie hidden in the dirt, waiting to catch you or a grandchild by surprise. And, at our age, a deep cut from rusted metal is the last thing any of us needs. So let's leave the hardware in the bin. I tell you this for a reason bigger than nails. The whole point of today is that the truth, plainly told, is worth more than any miracle on a label. The free things work because they feed the living soil, and the ones that don't, the rusty nail, the eggshell that was never going to cure the rot, the coffee grounds that were never going to turn the soil sour, those are worth knowing too. Telling you the honest difference is the most respectful thing I know how to do. When we started, I asked you to picture the gardeners who fed their families through the lean years, burying scraps like hidden treasure. The truth is, the one I picture is my own. The cracked hose, the tomatoes leaning every which way, a coffee can of eggshells by the back step. I spent years trying to feed those plants the way the catalogs told me to. It took me far too long, longer than I'd like to admit, to understand that she was never feeding the plants at all. She was feeding the ground beneath them. Quietly, patiently, the way her own mother had taught her, with whatever the kitchen and the yard gave back. She never spent a dollar she didn't have to, and her garden fed people for 40 years. I think about that every spring, when I tip the first bowl of scraps into the ground. It was never really about the tomatoes. It was about belonging to a long line of people who knew how to make something out of almost nothing, and who left the soil a little richer than they found it. That's a kind of inheritance you can't buy, and you can't lose. You just keep passing it down. If that's the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you'd like to grow into, then you already belong here. Pull up a chair beside us, subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way, one buried scrap at a time, together. Tomorrow morning, you don't have to try all 20. Just take the coffee grounds or that banana peel walk out into the cool air, and give it back to the soil. The ground knows exactly what to do with it. It always has.